the palace walls had never felt so hollow. As Princess Anne stepped out for the final time, silence screamed louder than a royal proclamation. Those who had served her, some for decades, stood frozen not in duty, but in disbelief. They weren't prepared for this moment. After years of unwavering devotion, Anne had simply walked away. No parade, no press, no farewell tour. Just her, slipping into history with the same quiet resolve she had brought to every royal engagement. But this time, something was different. Something was breaking, something too sacred to name aloud. Tears welled in the eyes of housekeepers, secretaries, valets. These weren't just employees. They were companions in a silent war of public pressure, private sacrifices, and ceaseless loyalty. And now, their general had laid down her command. This wasn't retirement. This wasn't resignation. It was abandonment, but not of duty. It was a farewell to a system that no longer mirrored her values. And they all felt it. The walls, once sturdy with tradition, suddenly felt like they might collapse without her. Anne wasn't just a royal. She was the monarchy's anchor, its invisible backbone, and with her departure, the structure itself trembled. No speech marked the occasion. No announcement softened the blow. Just Anne's steady footsteps fading into the distance. That silence? It was louder than thunder. And it wasn't lost on anyone. The staff, hardened by years of ceremonial precision, wept like children watching a family member disappear. Because in many ways, that's exactly what she was. Anne had been more than a presence. She had been the pulse of the palace, the quiet heartbeat beneath the crown's pageantry. And now, that rhythm was gone. Her exit wasn't marked by cameras or headlines, it was marked by emotion, confusion, and a haunting absence. And though she had often moved through those halls unnoticed by the press, the staff always noticed. They noticed the handwritten notes on birthdays, the quiet inquiries about an ailing spouse, the genuine gratitude in her eyes when someone had gone the extra mile. She had never needed a spotlight to shine. And now, in leaving without one, she burned brighter than ever. But this wasn't about theatrics. This wasn't for show. It was a statement louder than any royal decree. Anne was done. And nobody, not even those closest to her, seemed to understand why. That mystery lingered in the air, heavier than the history wrapped around the castle's stone walls. They all sensed it. This wasn't just the departure of a royal, it was the closing of a chapter. A sacred one. A final one. But as tears dried on palace sleeves, the question grew heavier: what had really broken the monarchy's strongest link? She never asked for applause, but Anne's shadow loomed larger than any spotlight could capture. For more than 5 decades, she marched through the corridors of royal duty like a soldier on the front lines, rarely celebrated, often overlooked, but always indispensable. While other royals wavered, stumbled, or surrendered to scandal, Anne never flinched. Her loyalty was unshakable, her pace unrelenting. Year after year, she quietly outran even King Charles in official engagements, logging hundreds of appearances, visits, and commitments without ever demanding recognition. She did not pursue influence, nor did she crave admiration. Instead, she carried the monarchy on her back, like it was a sacred oath carved into her very being. Her work ethic wasn't just impressive, it was mythical. Where others faltered in the spotlight, she thrived in the shadows. While tabloids feasted on royal meltdowns, divorces, and drama, Anne remained immune. Her name wasn't a headline, it was a standard. She never played the victim. She never played the star. She played the role the crown demanded, even when it cost her comfort, time, or personal peace. And in that silence, she earned something more powerful than celebrity. She earned reverence. Her absence isn't just the removal of another royal from the picture. It's the crumbling of the foundation that once held everything upright. This wasn't about just showing up to ribbon cuttings or delivering rehearsed speeches. Anne's contributions were woven into the very fabric of royal function. Military bases, hospitals, charities, diplomatic circles, she was everywhere, yet never the center of attention. She didn't need the camera to validate her. The cause was enough, and for that, she wasn't just admired, she was trusted. Trusted to show up, trusted to hold the line when others fled, trusted to do the work without excuses or theatrics. She became something rare, a royal whose legacy wasn't built on spectacle, but on substance. And now, with her gone, the structure of the monarchy feels exposed. No amount of ceremony can disguise the void she leaves behind. Because Anne wasn't just part of the machine, she was its engine. Steady, loyal, unbreakable. The palace didn't just lose a working royal, it lost its heartbeat. In many ways, Anne was the last of her kind, a vanishing breed of royalty that still believed in silent sacrifice over sensationalism. She didn't adapt to trends, didn't chase digital relevance, didn't mold herself to modern tastes. She remained firm in her principles, even as the institution around her began to morph into something more performative than purposeful. That quiet defiance became her strength, and perhaps that's what made her departure feel less like a retirement and more like a warning, an echo of a time when duty was everything. Yet behind her disciplined schedule and iron resolve, something was quietly shifting. She didn't need farewell speeches. Her footsteps through the garden were louder than any goodbye. In the final days before her departure, Princess Anne moved through the estate like a soul tethered to memory. Each morning began not with ceremony, but with silence. She would rise early, as she always had, dress plainly, and vanish into the cold breath of dawn, walking the grounds alone. To the untrained eye, it was nothing more than routine, but those who had watched her for years knew better. Her gait was slower. Her eyes lingered longer on corners of the estate most had forgotten. Every step whispered a secret. Every pause was a quiet goodbye. It wasn't just the rhythm of her movements that changed, it was the weight of them. She stopped to brush her fingers along the wooden railing of the staircase she had climbed for decades. She stared at the gate beyond the rose garden, as if it still held echoes of conversations long gone. She didn't speak of leaving, but her body had begun the process of letting go. And while no announcement had been made, her silence said it all. Something was ending, and this time, there would be no return. Then came the gestures. Small to outsiders, monumental to those who received them. A signed photograph for the gardener's son. A handwritten note for the housekeeper who had brought her tea every morning for 15 years. No grand speeches, no farewell parties. Just short, personal messages, each one a fragment of her heart, sealed with ink and grace. She gave them with a slight nod, a faint smile, and a touch that lingered a moment too long, as if she was imprinting herself on them before she disappeared. Inside her chambers, nothing had been touched. The furniture was in place. Her wardrobe remained folded in precise lines. But her journal once, her nightly ritual had remained closed for days, not abandoned. Concluded, as though she had already written her last line. Those who knew her best didn't dare ask why. They simply watched and felt. The estate, once bustling with unspoken energy, had slowed to match her pace. Time itself seemed to bend around her, giving her space to walk through the past before stepping into the unknown. This wasn't the behavior of someone taking a break. It was the graceful unraveling of a life defined by purpose. It was as if she was packing away not just her belongings, but pieces of herself. The laughter that once filled the dining room no longer echoed. The firm footsteps that once commanded attention now carried the weight of sorrow. Even the air felt different, heavier, mournful. Those closest to her recognized the transformation, and they knew. She wasn't just walking away from duty. She was releasing a part of herself that could no longer survive within the palace walls. And then, when the last step echoed through the stone halls, hearts shattered because they knew she was never coming back. Her absence didn't echo in just one estate. It shook the entire kingdom. The silence that followed Anne's quiet retreat from Edinburgh reached far beyond the stone walls of her former home. It crept into the corridors of Buckingham Palace, unsettling even the most seasoned advisors. Anne had been many things, a sister, a daughter, a royal, but to those behind closed doors, she had been the monarchy's compass. And now that compass was gone. The directionless stillness left in her wake unsettled even the firmest foundations of the crown. Inside Buckingham, tension crackled through every corridor like a storm no one dared name. Meetings that once flowed with ceremonial ease turned into tight-lipped discussions marked by glances and guarded words. The air was thick, the energy sharp. Advisors once confident in their plans and projections spoke in hushed tones, their voices laced with uncertainty. Anne's departure wasn't explained, not even to them, and that silence was more frightening than any scandal, because it suggested that something had gone deeply, terribly wrong. King Charles, normally measured and composed, had shifted. His expressions betrayed fatigue. His tone lacked the grounding presence he had once drawn from his sister. She had been his silent strength, the one who absorbed pressure so he could maintain his poise. Without her, his vulnerability was exposed. And though he didn't speak of her leaving, everyone around him felt it. This wasn't just a personal loss. It was a fracture, a tear in the royal fabric that no title or tradition could mend. Rumors began to stir. Not the kind plastered across tabloids, but the kind whispered in corridors by men in tailored suits who knew too much. Some believed Anne's retreat was a signal, not a choice. A message to those inside the institution that something sacred had been violated, that the monarchy had drifted too far from its roots, too deep into performance and politics, abandoning the values that had once made it unshakable. Anne's silence, once seen as discipline, was now interpreted as defiance, and with that silence came dread. Because if the most loyal, most unshakable member of the royal family had quietly turned her back, what did that say about what was happening behind those palace doors? Her exit wasn't a departure, it was a reckoning. A symbolic unraveling of the old guard, a prelude to a storm no one had prepared for. And those inside the palace knew it. They could feel the shift, not just in protocol or policy, but in spirit. The monarchy, as they knew it, was changing, and not everyone would survive the transformation. And then came the envelope handed silently to her secretary, containing truths no one was ready to face. It wasn't a royal decree, it was a whisper from a daughter and the queen herself. When the envelope reached Anne's private secretary, there were no grand instructions, no declarations, just a quiet handoff, deliberate and loaded with weight. Inside wasn't an official memorandum or a prepared press release. It was something far more personal. Tucked between thick parchment pages lay Anne's journal, a modest, leather-bound volume worn at the edges by time, secrecy, and solitude. For years, she had poured her thoughts into it, not for the public, not even for family, for herself. It was a sanctuary of truth, untouched by protocol and untouched by the palace's ever-churning machine. But now, she had chosen to let it speak. The pages revealed a different Anne than the world knew. Vulnerable, wounded, burdened by contradictions. Time and again, one line appeared in various forms. The day everything changed, I knew I couldn't stay. That single sentence haunted the script of her reflections. She didn't name the day. She didn't explain the event. But its impact echoed across the pages. Something had happened so seismic, so personal, that even her lifelong commitment to duty could not hold against it. She had remained silent for years, fulfilling her role with grace, masking her doubt beneath the armor of routine. But now, in the safety of her own words, she confessed what her poise had hidden. What made the journal truly shattering, however, wasn't just the emotion. It was the reference to a secret letter one handed to her by Queen Elizabeth II before her death, a letter that had never been seen by the public, never filed into the royal archives. Anne had kept it hidden, protected like a sacred relic. She had never quoted it, but her writing hinted that its message had permanently altered her view of the monarchy. A final message from a mother to a daughter, from a queen to her most trusted confidant. Was it a warning, a final confession, or perhaps a request to protect something no one else knew existed? Anne never said, but her behavior in the months that followed left little doubt it had pierced something inside her that could not be mended. She had lived by a code that valued silence over spectacle. So even as the truth clawed at her from within, she chose privacy over publicity. But in passing on her journal, she did something rare. She offered a piece of her internal world, not to fuel gossip, but to pass on the weight of responsibility. And as that weight shifted from her shoulders to the unknown hands of history, the monarchy itself trembled. Because if Anne, the most stoic, the most loyal, had been carrying a truth so devastating, what did that say about the crown? But beyond private letters and journals lay deeper cracks, ones shaped by a long-standing rivalry. Some grudges grow quiet with time, others turn into quiet wars. For Princess Anne, the distance she kept from Queen Camilla wasn't born of petty jealousy or passing disagreement. It was forged in betrayal and buried in principle. From the earliest days of Charles and Diana's troubled marriage, Anne had watched the affair unfold, not just as a sister, but as a sentinel of royal tradition. She didn't need to speak it aloud. Everyone who knew her understood Camilla's presence represented more than emotional wreckage. It marked the unraveling of everything the crown was meant to protect. To Anne, Camilla was never simply a woman in love. She was a symptom of erosion of moral decay, parading as modernization. In her eyes, Camilla's history with Charles stained the institution in a way that could not be scrubbed clean by public forgiveness or softened by time. Diana had brought heart to the monarchy, humanity to the crown. But Camilla, in Anne's view, had brought disruption, and not the kind that liberates, but the kind that corrodes. As Camilla's influence within the family grew, Anne grew quieter, but her silence wasn't acceptance, it was containment. Behind the civility was a fortress of cold restraint. Anne never lashed out, never made public comments, but she never let Camilla in either. Her disapproval lived in the space between glances, in the distance between seats at family events. It was the kind of tension only insiders recognized, icy, immovable, and rooted in something deeper than personality. To Anne, Camilla wasn't just controversial. She was a fracture in the royal code of honor. And Anne, more than anyone, had lived by that code without compromise. She'd bled for it in silence. And now, it was being rewritten by someone she had never truly accepted. Over time, Anne watched as Camilla's image was rehabilitated. As the public warmed, as the titles shifted, as the cameras embraced the narrative of redemption, Anne remained unmoved. Not out of cruelty, but conviction. In her mind, tradition wasn't just a ceremony, it was a standard. One Camilla had violated in the most public and personal way. The death of Queen Elizabeth only intensified the fracture. With the matriarch gone, the final buffer between old loyalty and new legitimacy had vanished. And for Anne, that was the moment something inside her broke for good. She didn't erupt, she simply withdrew. Further, quieter, more resolute than ever. Those close to her sensed it. Her tolerance, long stretched, had finally snapped. Camilla's elevation to queen consort wasn't just a title. It was a rewriting of the story Anne had dedicated her life to uphold. And no matter how polished the facade became, Anne couldn't betray the truth she still carried. Because while others were willing to forget, Anne remembered. She always remembered. And in the vacuum of the Queen's passing, old loyalties clashed with a new royal order. She never spoke it aloud, but Diana's memory lived in every choice she made. For Princess Anne, the past was not something to be buried. It was something to be honored, especially when it bore the face of a woman who had changed everything. Diana was not just her brother's wife. She was, in Anne's quiet view, the soul of a modern monarchy. While others praised Diana for her style or charisma, Anne saw something more enduring: her capacity to feel, her ability to connect, her refusal to treat royal life as performance. And though Anne was never known for emotional displays, she respected that kind of courage. In private, Anne had always followed protocol. She was the iron spine of the institution, but Diana showed her a different strength, the strength of openness. She saw how Diana brought warmth to cold halls, how she turned public duties into acts of healing. It was not lost on Anne that people loved Diana not for her title, but for her truth. She saw how Diana mothered William and Harry with intention, how she challenged tradition not to rebel, but to improve it. Diana wasn't flawless, but she was fearless in a way that made Anne reflect on what the monarchy was supposed to stand for. And that reflection lingered long after Diana was gone. So when Camilla began to rise, not just in proximity, but in status, something inside Anne hardened. It wasn't jealousy, it was justice. Camilla's growing role felt like a betrayal of everything Diana had stood for. A rewriting of history that conveniently skipped the pain, the fallout, the quiet strength it took for Diana to carry on under scrutiny. Anne couldn't accept it. She had seen what that pain looked like. She had watched the palace hold its breath through the storm Diana weathered. To now celebrate the woman who had once stood at the center of that storm, it was too much. Anne didn't wage a war. She never would. Instead, she chose to uphold the legacy in her own silent way. Through restraint. Through remembrance. Through refusal. Every nod she didn't give, every hand she didn't extend, was its own kind of tribute to the woman who had once reminded the royal family of its heart. Anne didn't move on just because time did. She carried the ghost of Diana not with drama, but with quiet defiance. And perhaps that's what cut deepest in the end. Because as the institution leaned further into reinvention, as titles shifted and roles blurred, Anne stood still. She represented a past the monarchy didn't want to forget but didn't know how to carry forward. And while the world embraced change, Anne's loyalty stayed rooted in the values Diana had helped awaken: sincerity, compassion, humility. But loyalty to the past often comes with a price, and for Anne, that meant stepping aside from a system that no longer recognized it. With Anne gone, the crown isn't just lighter, it's lost its spine. The quiet force that once kept the monarchy balanced between past and future has vanished, leaving behind a void no title can fill. Now, the family stands exposed, torn between King Charles's rigid adherence to tradition and Catherine's emerging vision of a softer, more modern monarchy. What Anne once held in tension with silent strength is unraveling in public. And the contrast couldn't be starker. Where Charles doubles down on ceremony, hierarchy, and the echoes of his mother's reign, Catherine leans into openness, emotion, and relevance. Both claim to be preserving the monarchy, but from the inside, it looks like a battle for its soul. Anne had been the linchpin, quietly, invisibly bridging generational values without ever appearing to choose sides. She didn't speak, but her presence carried weight, and when conflict flared behind closed doors, it was Anne who held the family steady. Now, without her, the old guard and the new vanguard are on a collision course. The Queen's final message, hinted at in Anne's journal, may have revealed a preference, or even a warning. Though its exact words remain hidden, the implications are impossible to ignore. Anne didn't step away out of fatigue. She stepped away with intent, and the message she carried from the Queen before her death, private, cryptic, but clearly urgent, might have confirmed her deepest fears about the family's direction. Inside the palace, the machinery still moves. Schedules are met, cameras roll, ceremonies unfold. But the seams are showing. Palace aides rush to project unity, yet the effort feels strained. Whispered conversations last too long. Eyes dart where they once stood firm. There's no scandal to report, only a creeping sense of instability. A feeling that the weight of the crown is growing heavier, not because of external threats, but because of fractures from within. The monarchy isn't broken yet, but it's bending. And for the first time in decades, people can feel it. Outside the gates, the public watches. Not with outrage, but with unease. It's not the pomp that feels off, it's the heart. Anne's departure, once seen as a personal decision, now registers as something bigger. It's a signal, one that something sacred has shifted, that the monarchy has entered a new era, not through declaration, but through quiet, irreversible loss. The image remains, polished and poised, but the spirit that held it together, unshaken, unspoken, is fading. The family still wears their crowns, but without Anne, their center has vanished. And what remains is a question no one dares answer aloud. And then came her final act, not loud, not formal, just devastating. She didn't leave with a royal salute, she left with a silence that roared. The final day came without warning, without ceremony. No trumpets sounded, no cameras rolled. And yet, it felt more significant than any coronation. The staff who had served her for decades stood in quiet formation, not out of protocol, but out of heartbreak. There were no formal goodbyes, just tear-streaked faces, trembling hands, and glances shared across the room that said everything words could not. They weren't watching a royal retire, they were witnessing the last of something sacred fade into the distance. Anne moved through them with calm, her presence more powerful in those fleeting moments than any title she'd ever worn. She paused to offer soft-spoken thank yous. A handwritten note slipped into a valet's hand. A firm handshake to the housekeeper, who had risen with her every morning for years. No speeches, just gestures. Each one precise, personal, and unforgettable. These weren't formalities, they were acknowledgments. A final show of humanity from a woman who had given her life to the crown, and who had now chosen, deliberately, to walk away from it. What she left behind was not just sentiment, it was weight. Her journal, filled with reflections too raw for public eyes, and the Queen's final letter, veiled in secrecy and heavy with implication, were placed into the hands of her most trusted aide. No one else was permitted to touch them. What those pages contained remains a mystery, but one thing is certain, they hold the truth she could never say aloud. A truth she chose to preserve, not expose. And with that choice, she reshaped the future more quietly than any declaration ever could. Anne's departure didn't collapse the monarchy, but it did reveal its fracture. She didn't bring it to its knees, but she made it kneel in reflection. Her absence is not a gap to be filled by appointment or bloodline. It is a void of presence, of character, of unshakable integrity that no new face can replicate. The royal family continues, the crown still rests on heads, but the silent force that once bound it together is gone. And in that absence, a question now haunts every corridor she once walked. Was this a retirement or a revolution disguised in grace? Because sometimes, the strongest message isn't shouted, it's what's left unsaid. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.